Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Overtime Podcast for the Corners Chapel. Most of the time, these episodes are audio only, but today we're doing something a little bit different. This one actually includes video, so you'll be able to see this conversation in just a moment. Today's episode is really a special one. I recently had the chance to sit down with Dr. Chris McKinny from Lipscomb University to go deeper into the world of the book of Joshua. As a church, we've been walking through Joshua together, and this conversation, like all of our Overtime podcasts, is meant to help us go even deeper than we go on Sundays, and specifically for this one, to help us better understand the historical, cultural, and archaeological background behind what we're reading. Dr. McKinny is an archaeologist and a biblical scholar, and he brings a ton of insight into questions like, what kind of world was Joshua written into? How should we think about archaeology and the Bible, and how do we process some of the harder passages that we come across? He also mentions this briefly in the interview, but he recently released a documentary exploring the search for the Ark of the Covenant. And no, not Indiana Jones style, but the real search for the Ark. And I haven't seen the full film yet, but I've watched the trailer. It looks incredible. And so at the very end of this episode, I'm going to play just a short snippet of that trailer to give you a taste. All right. Well, let's jump into the conversation with Dr. Chris McKinny. Well, thank you again for the time for jumping on here. So I am here with Dr. Chris McKinny, who I met in Israel. We were just talking about it was 10 years ago, believe it or not. So yeah, crazy. Crazy. Or I guess it'll be 10 years next month in May. But Dr. Chris, would you just introduce yourself and let people know kind of who you are and where you're streaming from right now?
Yeah, I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee. I teach at the Lanier Center for Archaeology, which is at Lipscomb University. I've spent many years living in Israel. I'm from Texas originally, which is where we didn't meet in Texas, but
Right.
I was there at the time when we went to Israel because I used to lead the Dallas Theological Seminary 3-week intensive study where Chase and I met. Was it 2016, I guess?
May
I
of
was just
2016.
thinking, I don't think the Browns or the Cowboys have done much since 2016.
Nope, only gone downhill.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's the background. And so the Lanier Center for Archaeology is a really unique place in the United States where you can study biblical archaeology, historical geography in its own context. We have an MA program, PhD program, and we have several archaeological projects in the field this summer. Hopefully with missiles, hopefully going down, not being fired at that, I should say. We'll be going to Ashdod of the Philistines and also Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee. So yeah, that's my domain here at Lipscomb.
Yeah. Well, I guess even before we get to the questions, I'm curious, how have you been able to go back in the last few years, or how has it been with just, without getting into all the geopolitical nonsense, just like how has that been for archaeologists
It's
over there?
been a real challenge. I mean, in some sense, normalcy ended in 2019 to some extent, with up until that point for almost 20 years, from the early 2000s on, which I mean, I was not old enough to really experience that. You had just a more or less static reality where you didn't have flights being canceled to some extent, and you were able to like kind of count on what was going to happen in the summer. COVID obviously disrupted the whole thing in 2020 and 2021, and then things seemed to all be normal in 2022, and then maybe you got the summer of 2023, and then the war has just been ongoing. And so we've had a few seasons since 2020 where we've been able to do some things, but we're hoping as of this summer, things begin to become a bit more normal, or the new normal, whatever that looks like. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's hard to predict.
Absolutely. Well, one more kind of just personal question before we dive into this. So did you kind of grow up wanting to be an archaeologist, and how did you find yourself in the field that you're in?
So I grew up in the church. My granddad was a farmer, and a pastor. So I grew up, going to his church and spending time with him on the combine and the cotton picker, and he'd tell me stories about World War II and the founding of the state of Israel, and really all of those things. And he had been to Israel a couple times in the 90s,
Okay.
and they had wanted for I had two brothers that wanted all of us to go
Mhm.
and experience it. And so I went when I was a young teenager. I had my goyish bar mitzvah, a Gentile bar mitzvah at 13, and
Oh,
it was kind of a crummy church tour.
mhm.
They took you to Bethlehem to go shopping more and eating, and but for me it was such a revolutionary moment, because I was able to really see that the stuff I'd been reading about, the stuff that I was visualizing in my head, some of it even like the War in 48, or the Holocaust and things that came out of it, was like, this is not like made up
Yeah.
science fiction or anything. It's like I can walk and go to that pizzeria that was bombed, and I can
Yeah.
go across take a bus and see the Western Wall, and I can go to all these places, and it's real and powerful. And so I wrote as a freshman in college, freshman in high school, what do you want to be when you grow up? I wrote biblical archaeologist.
Wow.
And so, I don't know if that was, I guess it's sort of prophetic, but I just knew from an early age that that's what I wanted to do. And I've stayed with it, and it's not always been easy staying
Yeah.
in this crazy field. But I just think it's so much fun and so rewarding.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that's actually a good segue into the first question. So, when people hear biblical archaeologist or archaeology in the Bible, what do they usually get wrong when they're thinking about that? What are some of the misconceptions?
Yeah, I think some of the most basic misconceptions is that archaeology is meant to be in service of proving something.
Mm,
Archaeology is really not about proof at all, in some sense that we're that there's like a colossal battle between secularism and religion, and that archaeology has to prove a Jewish point of view, a Christian point of view, a Catholic point of view, a Protestant point of view. It really isn't about that at all.
yeah.
That whole issue is more or less outside of what we're actually doing. What we're really doing is going to an archaeological site, or a series of sites, and trying to understand that archaeological site in its own context, in the
Mm,
context of what's going on at that particular site. And what I mean by that is, how does the topsoil relate to the thing below it, and how does one archaeological square relate to another archaeological square
mhm,
from a stratigraphic point of view, horizontally, vertically, and then how does it work with nearby sites? How does it work across the region?
mm,
And then, because we're excavating in a historical period or historical periods, we also have to, of course, bring in the historical texts that go alongside that. And that's a lot of different texts. That's the Assyrian text. That's Babylonian, Egyptian, and so on. But of course, it's the Bible itself.
right.
And so I think that biblical archaeology itself as a discipline is unique in that it is directly connected with the biblical world and the biblical literature, but its
Mm,
goal is not to prove or disprove. It's to really illuminate that world that sits behind the writing of the biblical text.
mm,
And I think a helpful analogy here is, if we think of classical studies and classical archaeology, the study of Greece and Rome, no one imagines that the excavations of Rome are meant to prove the Aeneid of Virgil, or meant to prove the Odyssey was historical.
mm,
And yet, the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Aeneid and all of these great classical texts from Greece and Rome, these are the literature that form what makes up classical studies and classical archaeology.
yeah.
And so they illuminate one another, and that's really the point here. And so I just often think that people that get into biblical archaeology, they have this kind of victim mentality that the world is out to get them, and maybe there is
Mm,
to some extent that there, but I sort of reject both sides of the equation. And I'll give you kind of a framework for this. We just finished a film, Legends of the Lost Ark,
Yeah.
that was in theaters, and I don't know if you guys can go check it out. Go do
Yeah.
it. We're excited for it to be there.
There we
But
go.
I get asked these questions all the time, like, what is this movie about? How do you do it? How is it different? And I think, biblical archaeology documentaries can be on the right. Everything in the Bible is true, and if you don't believe it, you're an idiot.
Hmm.
And on the left, everything in the Bible is not true and historical, and
Yeah.
if you do believe it, you're an idiot. Well,
Yeah.
that's not interesting, and that's also not true to the nature of the sources.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's, I guess, in a roundabout way of saying that biblical archaeology is really about trying to recover the ancient world through material remains. And the
Hmm.
material remains often cause us to go to texts, and often
Yeah.
cause us to go to thought and language and culture and geography. And
Yeah.
anywhere we're trying to answer those questions. And so that's why it becomes a bit of a package. But the
Yeah.
focus is material.
No, that's good. That's helpful. And again, this kind of segues into the next question of, so as an archaeologist, if someone was to ask you, how should we view the Bible? What would your answer be?
I think that in terms of how we should view the Bible is a unique text in that it is this record of a people that, by all accounts, were not the world leaders of their era. They were not the Egyptians. They were
Mhm.
not the Mesopotamian empires. They're not the Greeks. They're not the Romans, and from, by all accounts, really shouldn't have produced this enormous body of literature that has essentially changed the world and continues to change the world. And so as we look at the text of biblical archaeology, there is some really unique things about it, but there's also things I'd say that if we would read it as good literature, as opposed to just simply trying to only read it as a theological text and only
Yeah.
read it as a text that allows us to live holy lives. And
Hmm.
they're not to say there isn't theology there, of course there
Yeah.
is, but see the uniqueness of it, both as a very small people on the edge of the Roman Empire, or a very small people between Egypt and Mesopotamia, that then we get to really see a lot of its depth and significance. And really, I'd say seeing it against its own context allows us to see ways in which the biblical text has parallels with the other writings of the ancient world, whether it's
Yeah.
Greek, Roman in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament, Mesopotamia and Egypt, but also the stark contrasts in some ways. Like, for instance, the flood narrative,
Hmm.
or its conception of how deities should be portrayed with statues or not.
Yeah.
And so those types of things make it really stand out.
No, that's great. And one of the things that I tell our congregation all the time is that the Bible is one connected story. And I
Yep.
think when we think of the story that's being told, and then adding that layer that you just mentioned of setting the story of the Bible to the background of the story that was going on at the time and the other cultures, it brings out something even deeper. So that's good. That's awesome.
Yeah, I would even just add to that and say the biblical story is also unique in that it is able to redeem past meta narratives that have
Mm,
long been lost. I mean, we're still
mm,
talking about the Odyssey. Christopher Nolan will come out with a great movie this summer, I'm
yep.
sure. But it's redeemed through Western interaction, and specifically Christian interaction with it. And so one of the real powers of the biblical story is that it is adaptable, and it continues to allow every generation of Christians or Jews to continue to invest themselves into that story
That's
in a way
good.
that's really unique.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, so with that, our church is in the middle of a series through the book of Joshua. And so we've been in the series, I think, for about 10 weeks. And so yesterday, we just, as at the time that we're recording this, we just looked at the story of Jericho and is it I or AI?
As you like,
Okay, okay.
or ha I, it depends on how you want to pronounce it.
Okay, okay. Well, we just looked at that story yesterday, and so not even just narrowing into both of those stories, but just Joshua in general. Is there anything that jumps out at you from an archaeological perspective with regards to the story of Joshua in the book of Joshua?
So Joshua is an old friend. I've spent many, many, many years in the book, and I absolutely love it. And I think the most basic way of approaching the book is to understand that it is essentially two books. It's a book of narrative from Joshua 1 through 11, and I would even say Joshua 12 is a kind of summary of what's happened in the first 11 chapters. And then the last half, 13 through 24, is more or less a map or a
Mm.
series of maps that lay out where the Israelites are going to settle. So I did my dissertation on Joshua 15
Oh.
and 18, which are the most nerdy, detailed topographic lists in the Bible. And so the all of it's interesting, and from an archaeological perspective, the maps in particular, the Joshua 12 through 21, they give us the full the most in-depth details about the geography or the topography of ancient Israel.
Mm.
And so they're extremely important. And I would even say if we think of the Bible not only as a set of books, but as a way that's kind of building on itself, is that Joshua serves as kind of the maps for judges on through Joshua, really all the way through the books of Second Kings and even the
Mm.
prophets to some extent. And I always also like to say the Bible comes with maps at the beginning, not at the end, like
Right.
Genesis 10, for instance. So but Joshua 1 through 11 obviously is really unique in that it gives us the story of the so-called conquest of Canaan. And whereas these other chapters allow us to say, well, where are these places? We have a place name and we have ruins. How do we find these places? And then we can look at the archaeology and say, well, if we look at all of these sites, then we can say that this particular text, like Joshua 15, might date to this particular period, or Joshua 12 dates to this particular period. And I've done quite a lot of that particular study. But when we get to Joshua 1 through 11, then we have kind of historical questions about whether or not what's being described in these passages is history that we can define from an archaeological perspective. And I would
Mhm.
say specifically it relates to the conquest of Jericho in Joshua 5 and 6,
Yep.
the conquest of Ai in Joshua 7 through 8, and then the so-called Southern and Central Campaign
Yep.
in Joshua 10 with the Five King Coalition. And so for many, many years, I've been excavating at Tel Borna, which is biblical Libna,
Mm.
which is mentioned in Joshua 10. And so this has meant that we've dealt with this question quite a lot. And I would say kind of the headline version is that I think it's a challenge to go site by site and say, okay, this site has a destruction layer that we can connect with the historical Joshua. But if we look at the bigger picture, and we can do this in Joshua 12, where it says there are 30 places that Joshua conquered. There are about, I don't know, 40 or so very important late Bronze Age cities that exist in Canaan in the 13th century, and almost all of them are in that list of
Mm.
30 or so. And so, therefore, the world that is being described in Joshua 1 through 12, because that's the narrative plus the map, closely matches a Canaanite world
Mm.
as opposed. So, in other words, it's looking at settlement as opposed to military
Yeah.
conquest.
Yeah.
And so that's just a helpful way of saying there really is a historical framework or setting for seeing the character of Joshua and the conquest of the book of Joshua within the Canaanite world. They're not conquering Iron Age cities.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think that was one of the things that kind of stood out to me of when I was in Israel. And I remember not just Jericho, but specifically going to the site, I believe it was and how relatively small it was
Yeah,
in contrast to what you envision.
right.
Being from Northeast Ohio, you hear city, you think of Cleveland, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and just a massive miles and miles. And so I don't know if you want to speak into kind of maybe
Yeah, no, no.
the
So
difference.
the biblical word for city is very flexible. It's the word ear, not like the one on your head, but usually, transliterated IR. and it applies to Amalek, which is the city of the Amalekites, which definitely is a nomadic tent dwelling. And it also applies to Jerusalem. It
Yeah.
also applies to like major cities. So it really is better translated as a settlement.
Mm.
And we see this same use in Joshua, describing lists of cities that go from the biggest cities, like a city like Hatzor, 200 acres in size, to a site that we can't even locate on the map because it was probably nomadic or
Mm.
even seasonal. So that is a part that we have to kind of grapple with, is what is the text indicating, and what are our conceptions or misconceptions that we are bringing to the text.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think that even again segues into kind of the heart of what, as this shows during one of our home group Sunday messages, and what I'm really talking about. You read a lot of the text about conquest, specifically Joshua 8, and looking at it through Western lenses, it's shocking, right? They're
Yeah.
going in, they're wiping out entire um, settlements. And so, from your perspective, I guess a two-part question: how would the original readers have read this and understood this? And then also, um, from archaeology, do we have any evidence of the kind of practices and things that took place that could, for lack of better words, justify the judgment that was being carried out in that day?
Great question. And I think archaeology and just ancient literature in general is a really helpful way of dealing with this question. And so maybe I'll start with answering it from um, maybe another great epic, and that is the conquest of the city of Troy.
Mm.
If we think of the conquest of the city of Troy, uh, it ends in massacre. Like, it ends in horrific destruction that ultimately means that all of the people that are a part of that are judged. Odysseus and other people killed at sea. But all throughout that narrative, there is an explanation as to why these things happen, what choices are being given, the perniciousness of the gods, and so on. And so what I'm getting at is, it's ridiculous to read an ancient text and assume that an ancient author is just so cold-hearted that they would never consider the enemy as a person or people of honor,
Mm.
that is not going to think through choices, opportunities, that things could have been different. And so I would just say this is one of those places where we assume that the text itself does not have these built-in elements of opportunity, of free will, of
Mm.
choice. And to me, I think that's a misreading of the text. There's a great book written by my friend and colleague Matt Lynch called "Flood and Fury." It's
Mm.
specifically about this question of so-called genocide in Genesis 6 through 9, with the flood and the fury that we have in the book of Joshua. But I would even take it a step further and say, if we look at the narrative of the book of Joshua, what we really see is that at each stage, the local population, at each stage, the kings make a choice. They see the Jordan River dried up, and Jericho chooses to shut its gates.
Yeah.
Uh, Gibeon, for instance, they know they're next, and what do they decide to do? They decide to have a deception
Yep.
and dress up like a bunch of vagabonds. They come to Joshua and say, "We're from a far off country. Let's make an alliance." Now, there's different ways of interpreting that, as
Yeah.
if Joshua was wise, but
Yeah.
you don't see, like, Gibeon is making a choice to bow the knee with Yahweh.
Yep.
Psalm 10, what a great psalm, where we read it saying, kiss the son while he is in the way with you. In other words, when you encounter the real king, the real power, that has more power than your gods, you need to bow the knee. And if not, you're in trouble. We see the same thing with in Joshua 10, very explicit, where Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, when he hears that the Jordan River has happened, that Jericho has fallen, that Ai has fallen, and that Gibeon has made an alliance with Joshua, he's afraid, and which is good. He should be afraid, but
Hmm.
it then makes the fateful choice to, instead of letting fear lead to fealty, to the one true king, he casts in his lot with what he believes can save him from the situation.
Yep.
And I would say, again, if we read this as literature, it's the same themes we see in epic literature. It's the two towers, right? It's Sauron, like
Yep.
it's Sauron saying, "Nope, I got to cast my lot in with Sauron because
Yes.
I'm just." It's this. So it's built into the literature. Now, at
Yeah.
the end of the day, you might say, "I don't like that because that's how the ancient world operated, and kings make decisions for everyone. I wish it was more democratic."
Mm.
But not even acknowledging it, I think, largely misses
That's a
the
good
point.
point. Yeah.
And so I'd say from a literary side, that's one. The other question I would say when you asked about archaeology, we do know that the practice of the ban, the cherem, throughout this text, that they should be placed under the ban, that you shall, destroy their cities and kill. This was something that was well known. We know from the kingdom of Moab, essentially the Bible of ancient Moab, the Mesha Stele. It relates to Second Kings chapter 3, the same character of
Mm.
Mesha of Moab. He claims to have placed the Israelites of,
Mm.
of the tribe of Gad under the ban, and he drove them out and killed all of them. Some of it very clearly seems to be hyperbolic.
Yeah.
That is, that we are going to attack and we are going to restore the supremacy of our deity over this particular place. And so we could get into questions of, does it actually reflect reality? And the answer to that question is, it definitely does not
Yeah.
reflect reality, because the biblical text explicitly says that they didn't drive out these
Exactly.
peoples.
Yeah.
So is it like the question of what is the intent of the command to do it in the first place, which gets at the heart of who God is?
Hmm.
And if it is that, then it's really hard to even figure how it would actually work, because the reality is that the Canaanites become Israelites.
Yeah.
Like, they become part of the people of God, for better or ill.
Yeah.
And so I just would like to focus primarily on how, look, texts that make their way into the canon of the Bible, that become these things that we keep coming back to, they have good narrative features that people in the ancient world weren't dumb. They look to those elements and they see, well, this is the justification for why
Yeah.
we were able to go and defeat them, because look, this is the decision they made. It's like we do today in war, right? We can go carry out this, but look what this person has done to cause that. It's
Yeah.
always been a part of it, and if we just ignore it, we really miss that feature.
No, that's a good point. And I know one of the things for me, and I'd love to hear your thought on this, of it, I think when we look at any literature, for whether it's the Trojan War, whether it's the Bible,
Mhm.
we're almost coming from a place of sometimes through Western lenses of those that were conquered, those that were destroyed were completely innocent and hadn't made any decisions to, be
Yeah.
in opposition to the people. And so I don't know, there's almost this element of like the criticism from Joshua 8 is coming from, look at how Israel went in and wiped out these completely innocent people that,
Yeah.
were the good guys just sitting in their little settlements. And so I don't know if
No, no,
that's,
no. It's a great point, and I would say this is one thing I kind of jotted down to bring up. There is kind of the nature of the human guilt, and we see this again starting in Genesis 15, where God says to Abraham that you're going to go and this is the land that I'm going to give you, but I'm not going to give it to you yet because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So there already you have this, the God who judges people, and if he doesn't have the right to judge people, who does?
yeah,
But I would say there is this element of personal human autonomy and agency where they commit sins, and therefore they need to be judged. That's just the history of the world. That's the history of
mhm,
Israel, right? That when they're driven out of the land, it's the rod of Yahweh's anger is Assyria that drives them out.
yeah,
But I'd also say one thing we can often miss when we read these texts is to assume that it's entirely a human story. That is, the
Mm,
Israelites, the humans, and the Canaanites or Amorites, the humans, and that God is favoring these people, these humans, over against these humans over here. And how is he just in doing so?
yeah.
I think that's a misreading as well, or at least it's an incomplete reading. A much more complete reading sees that God is actually making for himself a people of his own inheritance among the nations. And this gets
Mm,
back to, something that's much bigger with how the worldview of the ancient world was really territorial. And that is, peoples have gods that go with their land. Moab, Ammon, Philistia, these belong to these entities. And so when God says to Moses and to Joshua, go into the land, he is claiming it for his, and there's hostile deities at work there. And it's the courage of Rahab, it's the courage of the Gibeonites. It's the courage of people that find themselves in the way with Yahweh, that kiss the representative of him, Joshua, that are bowing the knee in fealty to him, that are not just turning their back on their way of life, but they're turning their back on their gods
yeah.
and worshiping the one true God. And that's what's so frustrating to me about how this is often framed. It's not the success story of Rahab and the success story of the Gibeonites. It's the just the idea of judgment in general that we're
Yeah.
so uncomfortable with. And I think that missing piece really is the gods of the ancient world, which are presented as pernicious, which
Mm,
are presented much in the Iliad way of just kind of after their own ends. And I would just make an aside to this, which I think is probably often missed, is that if we think of Jesus going to the Jordan River and having the spirit of the dove descended upon him by Elijah, of course, this connects with Moses
yep.
and Joshua and Elijah and Elisha. He then has 40 days, like Joshua, and the name is the same, Joshua,
Yeah.
Jesus,
Yeah.
40 days in the wilderness, temptation. He passes the test. And then he goes scorched earth in the Galilee, a kingdom of heaven. He
Hmm.
is driving out the unclean spirits. It's a conquest of the region of the shadow of death.
Mm,
And so and again, he's not attacking people, but he's attacking the unclean forces of darkness that are behind them in much the same way that we see in the biblical story. Now, the problem is in the Hebrew Bible is they fall prey to the nations that they actually conquer,
yeah.
the enemies. And so Jesus is going after kind of the cancer at the heart of this whole system.
Yep.
But people don't often realize that Jesus's own ministry is modeled on a conquest narrative in which he is Joshua, he
Yeah.
is Elisha, carrying out these signs and wonders against the remnant of the forces of darkness that are still around and
Yep.
ahistorical to that are just still in the land. So I just think that's another helpful angle to see it as an interpretation of how they understood the story of Joshua.
No, that's so good, and we're just about out of time here. But I can't help but think of the end of Joshua 5 and the Lord's commander, and
Yep.
he shows up, and Joshua, what side are you on?
Yeah.
No.
And sandals, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
sandals,
Yep.
right? And,
Exactly.
and John says, right, I'm not worthy to untie your sandal. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
clear it's the same story.
Yeah, yeah. So that's so good. So, well, I want to. I think you pretty much answered the heart of all the questions that I had, and I want to give. If you can just in a minute or so give a little preview for the documentary that's coming out. I know you mentioned it a little bit, but
Yeah.
yeah, what have you been working on, and where can people find it, and when, and all of that?
Yeah, so Legends of the Lost Ark is a docudrama, and what that means is that it has dramatic elements that we filmed, really discuss almost or most of the story of the Ark. The Ark story is really huge. The Ark of the Covenant from its birth to its death, and maybe its possible return. And so it deals with what did the Ark look like, what's its Egyptian background. But so really answering the question, what is the Ark? And then also mainly focused on what happened to the ark from the ancient sources themselves. And so what we attempted to do is to really demonstrate how the story of the ark is foundational to the story of the Hebrew Bible. And this is not only in the documentary, but something I'm continuing to work on, that if you were to kind of boil down the whole story of the Bible, not just the Hebrew Bible, I think if you put it into one object, it wouldn't be the cross, it wouldn't be the empty tomb, it would be God's throne in the form of the ark. And so a story that starts with God's presence in Genesis and ends with God's presence in Revelation revolves around God taking on the flesh of a tabernacle, which I like to call the kind of the Hebrew Bible incarnation. Of course, he later takes on the flesh of humankind, but it's all connected with this idea of what the ark is, and its loss at the end of the destruction of the temple in 586 BC was such of major consequence for really all of history, but all of the rest of the biblical story, because it's at that point where people realize God's no longer among us. So what do we do? Like Pentecost is a direct result of that. So this film explores what ancient Judeans living in the era of the Second Temple period thought about what happened to the heart of their faith, the Ark of the Covenant.
And when's it come out, and where can people?
It's actually just came out this Sunday. So we had the first screening. There's and then there's another screening Tuesday, April 14th and April 15th, depending on where you are. So you got to go out and see it. Go out and see it now. But there's also going to be, of course, streaming down the line.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited. And I guess without spoilers, one question: is the Ark in a U.S. government warehouse with a bunch of cases being wheeled in at the end of, like at Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Well, at least in the movie it was. It was in the movie. But Raiders is great. I love Raiders. We'll have to check out the movie.
There we go. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I want to pray for you just as we end this time together. And again, thank you so much for being willing to jump on here.
My pleasure.
God, thank you for Dr. Chris McKinny and the work that he's been doing. And Lord, thank you for us being able to meet 10 years ago now, everything you've done since then. And so, Lord, I just pray specifically for protection for him and for his colleagues as they venture back into the land and continue to dig. Lord, will you guide their steps? Will you allow them to keep their eyes on you? And God, just thank you for the work that they're doing. And will people continue to grow deeper in their faith because of the work that they're doing? Thank you for this conversation. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Overtime Podcast. I hope that this conversation helped you see the book of Joshua and really the whole biblical world a little bit more clearly. Like I mentioned in the beginning, Dr. Chris has a documentary out right now exploring the search for the Ark of the Covenant. I don't think I can play the full trailer here, but I do just want to give you a quick 30-second snippet.
The Ark of the Covenant, infinite power, settled on a temporal vessel, the very throne of God. But in a moment, it was lost.
All of a sudden, gone.
Legends have whispered of the Ark's fate.
Every legend is based on some aspect of truth.
My goal is to put an X marks the spot for where the legends point to.
Chris has investigated these legends more thoroughly than ever before.
All right, well, I will definitely be checking that out soon. I hope you will as well. Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you happen to just stumble on this episode, we are a church plant that meets at the Nordonia High School in Macedonia, Ohio. We would love for you to join us for a service, either online or in person at 10:30 on Sunday mornings. Thank you again to Dr. Chris for joining us. As always, we hope these spur you on to want to gather in the corporate gathering of God's people, to connect even deeper with God's people, to know God, to grow in faith, and ultimately to go and live on mission so that all the corners of the world will know the name of Jesus. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.